Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the two major problems which Rishi Sunak has now that nurses have rejected the latest pay offer and are set to organise the largest strike yet, potentially coordinated with junior doctors. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, with the public sector strikes, which have been taking place amongst multiple sectors for nearly a year now, really, I said that the strategy had to be different to, say, a private sector strike, and I hoped that the unions had thought of that. See, with a private sector strike, such as the looming strike for Amazon workers, or the countless private sector strikes that took place last year and went along a normal route and were solved, you know, the calculations are much more straightforward. The business owners want to keep costs, including wages, as low as possible to maintain high profits. So if the workers want to leverage their labour for decent pay, they have to convince bosses that it is cheaper to give them a decent pay rise than it is to suffer lower profits from the lost productivity. The withdrawal of labour has to cost them more than just giving them a decent pay, really. Now, usually these things are settled before any strike is necessary. If a strike happens, it is because one side or the other has made a miscalculation. Either the workers underestimated just how much productivity the bosses were willing to accept, and they end up in a position where even a better pay offer doesn't work out as worth it when you consider the pay lost from the strikes. Or the bosses underestimate the resolve of the workers to continue until they get their better pay offer. But the public sector strikes are different. In theory, the same economic arguments should hold sway, but they don't. See, all of the public sector strikes so far have already cost the Treasury more than it would have done to meet the original demands. And you never actually have to meet the original demands. That is just the starting position. To avert strike action, all you need is to offer something acceptable, which is somewhere in between. So economically, the government allowing these strikes to continue has made no sense. It has harmed the economy. It has cost the Treasury. But these are Tories. It's not their money, so they're wasting, but ours, so they don't care. They're also unconcerned when workers leave for better pay in the private sector because they want public services to collapse. The leverage public sector unions have over a Conservative government is purely public opinion. And when I say public opinion, forget about the polls that show you that a majority of the public are in favour of this strike or that strike or the other strike. That's irrelevant. That doesn't matter. For the purpose of this calculation, it's worthless. It provides you your moral argument, but politically, nothing. What matters is the opinion of the Conservatives' target voters. These voters, however, have remained supportive of the NHS strikes, particularly for nurses. The government have attempted to manipulate public opinion by claiming that these workers are paid much more than they really are. You know, for example, with the rail worker strikes, they tried to talk about the pay that rail train drivers have, but these weren't train drivers that were striking at the time. Train drivers did strike, but that was a completely different union. You know, but they do that to reduce sympathy because it is known, there were some polling results last week that showed what causes people to be sympathetic to strikes is the feeling that the workers cannot cope on their wage. So if you try and convince people that their wages are higher than they really are, their sympathy goes down. That's the idea. And there was a government tweet the other day, for example, claiming various rates of pay for junior doctors. In fact, one of them wasn't even a junior doctor on this list. But it was fact-checked by responses to Twitter as complete twaddle. It was absolute nonsense. But because the public are largely on the side of NHS workers, the government do need to come to an agreement, especially as there's quite a few Tory MPs in marginal constituencies, particularly in like what you might call the Red Wall and similar areas where a lot of people prize the NHS. They don't like the way the continued strikes are hurting their chances at the next election. They're saying to Sunak, come on, get something done here. However, may well be that Sunak has created himself two extra problems with the failure to get nurses to agree to their latest piss-poor pay deal. Although the Tories are generally happy to suppress wages and see more NHS staff and public sector workers in general leave for private sector jobs, there are also two ways in which the government is vulnerable. Two clear ways. Sunak made 5 promises at the start of the year. They're not going very well. He's already shot the small boats promise in the head, and now 2 more are directly threatened by these strikes. First, waiting list. This is obvious enough. If NHS staff keep withdrawing their labour, then actually the waiting list will get worse. The government have got no chance of actually reducing those waiting lists to any significant degree. Second, growing the economy. So the latest news out, obviously when we get fresh news out of economic data, remember it always takes months to get the final figure. This is just an estimate at the moment, I suppose. But the figure at the moment for February, GDP growth is zero. Basically zero growth. The Tories were quick to blame the strikes. Oh, that's because of the strikes. Okay. The voters may be getting tired of excuses now. Is the economy growing? No, but it's because of you. It's because of the government. Also, anything which hits the economy more than the government calculated is likely to adversely affect borrowing, because their budget is set based on the tax revenues they expect to come in and the expenses they expect to go out. If the expenses are higher or the tax revenues are lower or both, then, well, that means more borrowing. So Sunak also promised to reduce the debt. Well, that's not going to look too good. In addition, strikes of this nature, and especially when the teaching strikes come into the mix, they impact productivity in other sectors. That could lead to inflation remaining higher than would otherwise be the case. And Sunak promised to halve inflation this year. He also keeps saying these pay rises would increase inflation. It's like, no. I'll tell you what increases inflation: strikes. You know, and he was quite clear. He's going to see the other promises. There's no time limit on this. Like, at some point in the future, I'm going to do this. You assume he means by the election, but at some point in the future, the inflation, no, it's going to halve this year. He was clear on that. But the promise on waiting lists and growing the economy, they're the ones most clearly threatened. The other two are sort of indirect. But waiting lists, growing the economy, directly impacted by if there was to be another full year of strikes. Although Sunak is potentially giving himself a cushion by aiming for an autumn election next year rather than May, there comes a point where he risks permanently losing any chance of support. Sunak and Hunt have claimed that their plans are now implemented. They've said, in fact, Hunt last week said, we can see that the economy's recovering now. I'm thinking the economy's flatlining, mate. But even with the election late next year, see, people might still decide they want to review the situation at the end of this year. After all, their plans are in place. Why do we have to wait for the election? Shouldn't we see some improvement by the end of this year? I mean, consider the current IMF forecast is for our economy to have contracted by 0.3% over the course of 2023. Jeremy Hunt dismisses the IMF forecast. He says the OBR forecast is more reliable. Fine, no problem. The OBR also say that our economy will contract this year. Yes, the precise figures will keep changing with new information. But the calculation right now is contraction. To avoid that contraction, something needs to happen to the UK economy that either the IMF and the OBR didn't foresee, or at least didn't think was likely to happen. Now, this could happen, of course. All sorts of random things will happen this year. But Sunak would want to stack the odds in his favour, you would think. So he'd want to actually engineer something that puts the economy into growth, even if it's not very high growth. But Sunak is suppressing wages. That itself is harmful to growth. He's artificially maintaining high inflation because he's allowing higher energy costs. That also hits the economy, as well as slowing down the reduction in inflation. He could massively reduce inflation overnight by applying a proper windfall tax, not to green energy producers, but to oil and gas companies, and use that money to compensate energy companies for what is now much lower wholesale cost of gas, and say to them, you're not allowed to make windfall profits either, and the cost of energy would tumble, and so would the inflation rate. But now, that's too easy, isn't it? But also by allowing strikes to persist, he's causing a huge hit to productivity. He could have sorted it all out last year. Now he's almost put himself in a position where it'll be more difficult now to find a way out where both sides are seen to be getting an acceptable deal. Because first rule of negotiation, surely, is try and find common ground that both sides can accept. Both sides can sell as a win to their side. Sunak is rapidly moving the Venn diagram circles apart in a duel to the death. Sunak is presiding over a Tory legacy of utter failure. He cannot win the next election without showing that he's getting something right that his predecessors kept getting wrong. He cannot paint Labour as too reckless to be let loose on the country. He just can't. People don't believe it anymore. He has to show that his Conservative government is going to be better than the Labour government. People aren't put off by a Labour government right now. He needs some wins. Obviously, he's going to loosen the purse strings in the next year's budget. Of course he is. Blatant attempt to do what they always do. Announce a nice sounding budget just before the election. Then you slam the coffers shut the following year. So he'll lower taxes, raise spending promises. The next year, taxes will go up, the spending will be cut. It happens every time. Every single time. Because that's all next year's budget will be. It's a little walk around the exercise yard before being locked back in our prison cells. But even that budget will be tricky if the economy has not grown in line with the Treasury's expectations. If they try and do a quasi-quarting and announce an uncosted budget, the OBR will be all over it. Hunt is not going to make the same mistake as Kwarteng and refuse to let the OBR run their analysis in order to hide their skullduggery. They need to announce a budget that means lots of tax cuts and spending boosts without massive borrowing. Because they do need both. It's not just, you think about the Tories, well, it's just the tax cuts. That works on some of their supporters. It's not going to work on the red wall voters, for example. They want to see the spending plans. They're not so bothered about the taxes. You know, they could, of course, they have the option of applying proper taxes to very wealthy individuals and corporations, so they could rebalance the tax burden. But they're really not about that life. Yes, I know they've inflicted the highest tax burden in 3 generations, but that's on the poor, not the rich. And the poor have nothing left to give other than their votes. So the Tories need a budget that cuts them some slack. Not sure how they plan to do that if 2023 sees another relentless wave of strikes. This is now potentially what the NHS and teaching unions have over the government. Not the economic hit directly, because nobody does more to damage the economy than the Tories. But the strikes now make it more difficult for Sunak to claim he's meeting his promises. He was never going to meet them in any objective sense anyway, but aided by the Tory media, he would create an illusion, claim success. But he needs something to act as a framework to pin that illusion on. If the economy shrinks this year, he's in trouble. If waiting lists don't come down this year, he's in trouble. If inflation remains high, he's in trouble. If he has to borrow more than planned, he's in trouble. If he doesn't handle these strikes properly, the only promise he'll have left is stopping the boats. And he's just admitted that he doesn't think he'll meet that one either. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.